The Colorado sun burned like molten copper over the endless prairie, casting long shadows across the cracked earth where nothing grew except sagebrush and broken dreams. Cole Mitchell wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his wagon toward the ramshackle cabin that was supposed to be his fresh start, a piece of land bought sight unseen from a desperate seller who needed quick money and fewer questions. At 45, Cole had learned that running from your past was easier than facing it, and this remote ranch in the middle of nowhere seemed like the perfect place to disappear. The seller in town had given him a strange look when he'd signed the papers, muttering something about folks around here not taking kindly to strangers. But Cole had brushed it off. He'd heard worse warnings before. The cabin came into view just as the afternoon heat reached its peak, shimmering waves rising from the sun-baked ground like ghosts dancing in the distance. Smoke was rising from the chimney, which made Cole's hand instinctively move toward the rifle at his side. Someone was trespassing on his new property, and after losing everything he'd owned back in Kansas, he wasn't in the mood for uninvited guests. But as he drew closer, he heard something that made his blood run cold, a sound that cut through the prairie silence like a knife through silk. It was weak, desperate, barely human, but unmistakably a woman's voice carried on the hot wind. "Spread it open. Cut me free." The words were so faint he almost thought he'd imagined them, but they came again, more urgent this time, followed by what sounded like sobbing. Cole jumped down from the wagon, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a dull thud, and followed the sound toward the fence line that bordered his property. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. A woman was tied to the wooden fence posts, her wrists bound so tightly with rope that her hands had turned purple and swollen. Her dress, once probably white or cream-colored, hung in tattered shreds around her body, and her golden hair was matted with dirt and dried blood. She had been there for hours, maybe longer, under the merciless Colorado sun without food or water. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her face sunburned and streaked with tears. But when she saw Cole approaching, her eyes, blue as a summer sky, flickered with the faintest spark of hope. "Spread it open. Cut me free," she whispered again, her voice no more than a rasp of breath against her damaged throat. At first, Cole didn't understand what she meant, but then he saw the knots binding her wrists, pulled so tight they had cut into her flesh. She wasn't begging for shame. She was begging for freedom. Cole pulled his knife from his belt and moved toward her, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? Who had done this to her? And why had they left her here to die on land that was supposed to be his sanctuary from the world's cruelty? But as he reached for the ropes that bound her, he had no idea that cutting her free would change both their lives forever, or that the woman hanging from his fence would soon give him something worth fighting for that he'd thought he'd lost the right to want. Cole's knife cut through the rope like it was made of paper, but the woman's relief was so profound that she collapsed the moment her bonds were severed. He caught her before she hit the ground, her body as light as a bird's wing and burning with fever. She was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently as he lifted her in his arms, and it was only then that he noticed something that made his blood run even colder than it already was. She was pregnant. Not far along, maybe 3 or 4 months, but enough that her condition was unmistakable once he looked past the torn dress and the evidence of her suffering. Someone had tied a pregnant woman to a fence and left her to die under the brutal Colorado sun, and Cole felt a rage building in his chest that he hadn't experienced since the war. He carried her toward the cabin, kicking open the door and laying her gently on the narrow bed that came with the sparse furnishings. The interior was stifling hot, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the dirty windows, but it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. Cole had learned field medicine during his time as a cavalry scout, patching up wounded soldiers when the regiment's doctor was overwhelmed or dead. Those skills came back to him now as he assessed the woman's condition with practiced efficiency. Dehydration was the immediate threat, followed by sun exposure and the infected cuts on her wrists where the rope had bitten deep. He poured water from his canteen onto a clean cloth and began gently cleaning her wounds, wincing at the way she flinched even in her semi-conscious state. Someone had tied those ropes with deliberate cruelty, pulling them tight enough to cause maximum pain without being immediately fatal. This wasn't random violence. It was torture with a purpose. As he worked, Cole found himself studying her face, trying to piece together the story written in her features. She was young, probably no more than 25, with delicate bones and soft skin that spoke of a life lived indoors until recently. Her hands, though battered now, bore no calluses from hard labor. This was a lady, not a working woman, which raised even more questions about how she'd ended up tied to his fence. When he dripped water onto her cracked lips, she stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness began to return. "Easy," Cole murmured, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you." Her eyes opened slowly, those startling blue irises focusing on his face with obvious effort. For a moment, confusion clouded her features, as though she couldn't quite remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then memory came flooding back, and she tried to sit up with a gasp of panic. "No, no," she whispered, her voice still raw from screaming and thirst. "They'll come back. They'll find me here. You have to." Her words dissolved into a coughing fit that shook her entire frame. Cole gently pressed her back down onto the pillow. "Nobody's coming anywhere near you while I'm here," he said with quiet conviction. "What's your name?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window as though expecting to see riders approaching through the heat shimmer. "Sarah," she said finally. "Sarah Bennett." The name came out reluctantly, as though she wasn't sure it was safe to admit who she was. "Well, Sarah Bennett, I'm Cole Mitchell, and this is my land now. You want to tell me who did this to you?" Sarah's face went pale, and she instinctively moved one hand to her stomach in a protective gesture that confirmed Cole's earlier observation. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "He's not just anyone. He's Robert Kane, and he owns half the territory. The law works for him, the judges take his money, and anyone who crosses him ends up—" She gestured weakly at her own condition. Cole had heard the name Robert Kane whispered in the saloons back in town, always with the kind of fear reserved for natural disasters and acts of God. A cattle baron who'd built his empire on the bones of smaller ranchers, Kane was rumored to control everything from the territorial legislature to the local sheriffs. If Sarah was telling the truth, Cole had just stepped into the middle of a war he couldn't possibly win. "Why does Kane want you?" he asked, though something in his gut already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Because I'm his wife," she said, the words falling like stones into the silence. "Or I was supposed to be. The marriage was arranged by my father to settle gambling debts, but when I found out what kind of man Kane really was, I ran." She shifted uncomfortably on the bed, and Cole saw her wince as the movement pulled at her injured wrists. "I made it almost to the border before his men caught me. They brought me back, and Kane, he said if I wouldn't come willingly, he'd make sure I had no choice in the matter." Cole's jaw tightened as the implication became clear. "The baby isn't his," Sarah said quickly, her eyes flashing with defiance despite her weakened state. "The man I love was killed trying to protect me from Kane's men. But Kane doesn't care about that. He says the child will be his heir whether I want it or not, and that I'll learn to be grateful for his generosity." The rage that had been building in Cole's chest since he'd found her tied to the fence now threatened to boil over. He'd seen enough cruelty in his lifetime. During the war, in the cattle drives, in the lawless territories where might made right. But there was something particularly vicious about Kane's plan that made his hands shake with suppressed fury. "So he tied you to my fence to, what? Soften you up? Make you more agreeable to his proposal?" Sarah nodded, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "He said the sun and the thirst would remind me that he's the only protection I have in this world. That when his men came back for me in the morning, I'd be ready to beg him to take me home." Cole stood and walked to the window, his mind racing through possibilities and finding most of them leading to his own grave. Kane had the law on his side, unlimited resources, and no apparent conscience about using either to get what he wanted. Going up against him would be suicide for any normal man. But Cole Mitchell wasn't exactly normal anymore. He'd lost everything that mattered to him once before. His ranch in Kansas, his brother Samuel, who'd been murdered by claim jumpers, his faith in justice and law, and the basic decency of mankind. He'd come to Colorado to die quietly, to fade away where nobody knew his name or his failures. Instead, he'd found a pregnant woman tied to his fence and a chance to stand for something again. "How long before Kane's men come back?" he asked, turning from the window. "They said dawn," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Cole, you can't fight them. There are too many, and Kane has too much power. You should just, you should just ride away while you can." Cole looked at her, this brave, broken woman who was still trying to protect him, even though she barely knew his name, and felt something shift inside his chest. Something he'd thought had died along with his brother and his old life. "I've been running away for 2 years," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time I remembered how to stand still." Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Cole of blood and fire. Somewhere out there, Kane's men were probably making camp, counting the hours until they could return to collect their prize. They expected to find a broken woman ready to submit to their boss's will. Instead, they were going to find Cole Mitchell, and he was done running from fights that mattered. The question now was whether he could keep Sarah and her unborn child alive long enough to figure out how to win a war against the most powerful man in the territory. As evening fell over the Colorado prairie, Cole began to plan for a battle that would determine not just their survival, but whether justice meant anything at all in a land where money and violence ruled everything. But first, he had to make sure Sarah was strong enough to fight alongside him, because something told him that before this was over, they were both going to need every ounce of courage they could find. Dawn was still 3 hours away when Cole heard the hoofbeats. He'd been sitting by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. Sarah had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep around midnight, her breathing steady but labored, one hand still protectively curved over her stomach, even in unconsciousness. Cole had used the quiet hours to fortify their position as best he could, moving furniture to create cover, checking his ammunition, and planning escape routes if things went badly. But Kane's men had come earlier than expected, and that change in plan told Cole everything he needed to know about their intentions. They weren't here to negotiate or give Sarah another chance to cooperate. They were here to take her by force, and anyone who got in their way would be removed permanently. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, hoofbeats echoing across the hard-packed earth like a drumbeat counting down to violence. Cole counted at least 6 riders, maybe more, which meant Kane had sent enough men to handle serious resistance. The cattle baron wasn't taking any chances this time. "Sarah," Cole whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. "Wake up. They're here." Her eyes snapped open immediately, the kind of instant alertness that spoke of weeks spent sleeping with one ear open for danger. She sat up carefully, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach before she seemed to remember where she was. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear Cole could see in her eyes. "6 that I can count, maybe more hanging back." Cole handed her his spare revolver, a Colt .45 that had seen him through more fights than he cared to remember. "You know how to use this?" Sarah took the weapon with surprising familiarity, checking the cylinder and testing the weight with movements that spoke of previous experience. "My father taught me before he lost himself in gambling and whiskey," she said grimly. "He said a woman on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself." "Good. Stay low, stay behind cover, and don't hesitate if you have to shoot. These men won't show you any mercy just because you're carrying a child." Outside, the horses had stopped just beyond rifle range, their riders barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Cole could make out shapes moving in the shadows, men positioning themselves for an assault that would come from multiple directions at once. These weren't cowboys or ranch hands. They moved with the disciplined precision of soldiers or hired killers. A voice called out from the darkness, carrying easily across the still air. "Mitchell, we know you're in there, and we know you've got something that belongs to Mr. Kane. Send the woman out, and maybe you live to see another sunrise." Cole recognized the voice from descriptions Sarah had given him. Tom Brennan, Kane's foreman and chief enforcer. A man who'd reportedly killed more people than cholera and considered mercy a sign of weakness. If Brennan was here personally, it meant Kane wanted Sarah back badly enough to risk his most valuable lieutenant. "The lady says she doesn't belong to anyone," Cole called back, keeping his rifle trained on the shadows where he'd seen movement. Maybe Kane should learn to take no for an answer. Brennan's laugh was like gravel sliding down a mountainside. Kane doesn't take no from anyone, Mitchell, especially not from some drifter squatting on land that ain't rightfully his. The words hit Cole like a physical blow. Kane owned this land too. Had he walked straight into another trap, just like the one that had cost him everything in Kansas? Sarah must have seen the realization cross his face because she reached out and touched his arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have warned you." Kane owns most of the territory, including this ranch. The man who sold it to you didn't have the right. Cole felt the familiar taste of betrayal in his mouth, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a cold, deadly calm that he hadn't felt since the war. Kane had manipulated him from the beginning, setting up a scenario where Cole would find Sarah and either turn her over out of gratitude for being allowed to keep his land or be eliminated as an obstacle to Kane's plans. "That's fine," Cole said quietly, his voice carrying a note that made Sarah look at him with sudden concern. "I've been cheated before. The difference is, this time I'm not walking away." "Mitchell," Brennan called again. "You've got 30 seconds to send her out, or we come in shooting. Mr. Kane wants his wife back, but he ain't particular about whether you're breathing when we leave." Cole stood and moved to the cabin's front door, keeping low to avoid presenting a target. "Tell Kane I've got a counteroffer," he shouted back. "He can ride out to California and jump in the ocean, and I'll consider not hunting him down and putting a bullet in his brain." The silence that followed was so complete Cole could hear his own heartbeat. Then Brennan's voice came back, no longer amused. "You just signed your death warrant, boy. We're coming." The attack came from 3 directions at once, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Bullets smashed through the cabin's thin walls, sending splinters of wood flying through the air like shrapnel. Cole dropped behind an overturned table and returned fire, his rifle barking steadily as he picked targets in the pre-dawn gloom. Beside him, Sarah had taken cover behind a pile of feed sacks, her borrowed revolver steady in her hands as she waited for clear shots. When one of Kane's men tried to rush the cabin's side window, she put 2 bullets in his chest without hesitation, her face grim but determined. "Nice shooting," Cole said, impressed despite the circumstances. "I told you my father taught me well," Sarah replied, reloading with practiced efficiency. "He also taught me that some men only understand violence, and Robert Kane is definitely one of them." The gunfight continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the cabin filling with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Cole had counted at least 2 men down, but Brennan and the others were still out there, moving closer under cover of concentrated fire. Then came the sound Cole had been dreading, the soft scrape of boots on the cabin's back wall. Someone was trying to get inside while the others kept them pinned down with gunfire. "Sarah, watch the front," Cole whispered, moving toward the back of the cabin. "Anyone comes through that door, shoot them." The back window exploded inward just as Cole reached it, glass shards cutting his face as a man tried to climb through. Cole grabbed the intruder by his shirt and hauled him inside, driving his knee into the man's stomach before pistol whipping him unconscious. But the distraction had cost him. When he turned back toward the front of the cabin, he saw that Brennan had made it to the front door and was raising his rifle toward Sarah's back. "Down!" Cole shouted, bringing his own weapon up, but he knew he wouldn't be fast enough. Brennan had a clear shot, and Sarah was focused on targets outside the broken front window. The rifle shot echoed through the cabin like thunder, but it wasn't Brennan's gun that had fired. Sarah spun around, smoking revolver in her hand, and Cole saw Brennan stagger backward with a shocked expression on his face. Blood was spreading across his chest, and his rifle clattered to the floor as he tried to understand what had happened. "You missed one important thing about my education, Mr. Brennan," Sarah said coldly, walking toward the wounded foreman. "My father didn't just teach me to shoot. He taught me to watch my back." Brennan's legs gave out, and he slumped against the doorframe, his eyes already beginning to glaze over. "Kane will never stop," he gasped. "He'll burn this whole territory to get you back." "Then maybe it's time someone stopped Kane," Sarah replied, her voice hard as winter iron. Cole stared at her, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. This wasn't the helpless victim he'd rescued from his fence. This was a woman who'd been pushed too far, who'd lost too much, and who was finally ready to push back. The pregnancy hadn't made her weak. It had made her fierce, a mother protecting her unborn child with the same deadly determination as a she-wolf defending her den. Outside, the remaining gunmen seemed to realize that their leader was down. Cole could hear them calling to each other, their voices uncertain now that Brennan wasn't there to give orders. They'd come expecting an easy job, collecting one woman and eliminating one troublesome rancher. Instead, they'd walked into a meat grinder. They're pulling back, Cole observed, watching shadows retreat into the darkness. But they'll be back with more men. Kane won't let this stand. Sarah nodded, checking her ammunition with the calm efficiency of a seasoned gunfighter. Then we'd better be ready for them. Because I'm done running, Cole. I'm done being afraid. And I'm done letting Robert Kane think he can take whatever he wants just because he has money and guns. Cole looked at her, this remarkable woman who just killed a man to save his life, who was carrying another man's child and facing down the most powerful enemy in the territory, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not just admiration or attraction, but something deeper. Something that felt suspiciously like hope. In that case, he said, reloading his rifle, I guess we'd better figure out how to win a war. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the Colorado prairie, Cole and Sarah prepared for the fight of their lives. Kane would come back with everything he had, and when he did, they'd be ready for him. Because sometimes the only way to find peace was to go through hell first, and they were both tired of running from the flames. Robert Kane arrived with the sunrise, and Cole knew immediately that everything was about to change. The cattle baron rode at the head of a column of 20 men, all mounted on fine horses and armed with the kind of weapons that money could buy. But it wasn't the show of force that made Cole's blood run cold. It was the man himself. Kane sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain, his silver hair gleaming in the morning light, his face carrying the kind of cold confidence that came from never having lost a fight that mattered. He was older than Cole had expected, probably in his 60s, but there was nothing frail about him. Kane radiated the kind of power that came from decades of getting exactly what he wanted, when he wanted it, regardless of who got hurt in the process. This was a man who'd built an empire on other people's broken dreams, and he wore that knowledge like armor. That's him, Sarah whispered from her position by the window, her voice tight with years of accumulated fear and hatred. That's Robert Kane. Cole studied the man who'd caused so much pain, looking for weaknesses and finding none that were obvious. Kane wore an expensive suit despite the early hour and the dusty trail, his boots polished to mirror brightness, his gun belt crafted from the finest leather. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, from his custom-made saddle to the gold watch chain that glinted across his vest. But it was Kane's eyes that truly unsettled Cole. Even at this distance, he could see the cold intelligence there, the calculating gaze of a man who viewed other human beings as chess pieces to be moved around his personal board. This wasn't a man who'd built his fortune through honest work. This was a predator who'd learned to dress like a gentleman. Kane raised his hand, and his men spread out in a wide semicircle around the cabin, cutting off any possible escape routes. The maneuver was executed with military precision, and Cole realized that many of these riders were probably veterans of the Indian Wars or the conflicts down in Mexico. Kane didn't just have money, he had an army of professional killers. Mitchell! Kane's voice carried across the morning air with surprising volume for a man his age. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I'm here to collect it. Cole stepped onto the cabin's front porch, rifle in hand but not yet raised. Behind him, he could feel Sarah's presence, could sense her gathering courage for what was coming. The morning sun was warm on his face, but the air itself seemed to crackle with tension. Mr. Kane, Cole called back, keeping his voice level and respectful. I'm not sure what you think I have, but this lady here says she doesn't belong to anyone. Kane's laugh was like ice cracking in winter. Lady, he repeated, dismounting from his horse with fluid grace. That's my runaway wife you're harboring, Mitchell. A woman who abandoned her lawful husband and her duties as a Christian wife. I'm here to take her home where she belongs. Funny thing about that, Cole replied, feeling Sarah step up beside him. She tells a different story. Says you forced her into marriage to pay off her father's debts, then tried to claim another man's child as your heir. Kane's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those cold eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that anyone would dare confront him so directly. He began walking toward the cabin, his hands clasped behind his back like a schoolmaster approaching a wayward student. You've been listening to a woman's hysterics, Kane said dismissively. Sarah's always had an overactive imagination. It's one of her more troublesome qualities, but nothing that can't be corrected with proper guidance. Cole felt Sarah stiffen beside him, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of steel that hadn't been there before. Proper guidance? She repeated. Is that what you call having your men beat the father of my child to death when he tried to protect me? Kane stopped walking, and for the first time, his mask of civilized control slipped slightly. James Morrison was a weak man who couldn't accept that you were promised to a better husband, he said coldly. His death was regrettable but necessary. The name hit Cole like a physical blow. James Morrison. He'd known a James Morrison during the war, a young cavalry officer with dreams of becoming a doctor, a man who'd saved Cole's life during a Comanche raid outside Fort Collins. Could it be the same man? Morrison, Cole said slowly. Tall fellow, brown hair, scar on his left hand from a saber cut? Kane's eyes narrowed. You knew him. He saved my life once, Cole replied, feeling a new kind of anger building in his chest. And you killed him for loving the wrong woman. I killed him for interfering with my business, Kane corrected, just as I'm about to kill you for the same offense. But something in Cole's face must have given Kane pause, because the older man tilted his head slightly, studying him with renewed interest. Mitchell, he said thoughtfully, that name sounds familiar. Where have I heard it before? Cole felt his stomach drop as recognition dawned in Kane's eyes. The cattle baron smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression, only the satisfaction of a hunter who just identified his prey. Samuel Mitchell, Kane said softly. Your brother, I assume. The stubborn fool who refused to sell his water rights up in Kansas? Who thought he could stand against progress and civilization? The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Samuel, his younger brother, the dreamer who'd believed that hard work and honest dealing would be enough to build a life worth living. The brother who'd been found shot to death on a lonely trail, his murder written off by corrupt lawmen as a robbery gone wrong. You killed Samuel, Cole said, the words coming out flat and emotionless despite the rage building inside him. I had him killed, Kane corrected with casual indifference. There's a difference. I rarely dirty my own hands with such unpleasant necessities. But yes, your brother's death was my doing. He held water rights that I needed for my railroad expansion, and he wouldn't see reason. Sarah reached out and touched Cole's arm, sensing the volcanic fury building inside him. Cole, she said quietly, don't let him goad you into something stupid. But Cole was beyond hearing her. The mystery of Samuel's death, the question that had haunted him for 2 years, had finally been answered, and the answer was standing 20 feet away, smiling like a satisfied cat. You want to know the best part? Kane continued, clearly enjoying the effect his revelation was having. Samuel died thinking he was protecting his land for future generations. He never knew that I'd already bought the judges who would invalidate his claims after his death. All that suffering, all that noble sacrifice, and it was meaningless from the beginning. Cole's hand tightened on his rifle, and for a moment the temptation to simply shoot Kane where he stood was almost overwhelming. But Sarah's grip on his arm reminded him that there were larger considerations at play. If he killed Kane now, they'd both be dead within seconds, and Sarah's child would die with them. I can see you're thinking about it, Kane observed with amusement, wondering if you're fast enough to kill me before my men kill you. But that would be very short-sighted, Mitchell, because I have an offer that might interest you. I'm listening, Cole said through gritted teeth. Kane reached into his vest and withdrew a folded document, holding it up where Cole could see it. This is the deed to this ranch, along with 2 adjoining properties. Sign Sarah over to me willingly, and I'll give you all 3 ranches free and clear. You can live here peacefully for the rest of your natural life, and no one will ever bother you again. And if I refuse, Cain's smile widened, then you'll follow your brother's path. But I'll make sure Sarah watches before I take her home. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken threats and bitter memories. Cole could feel Sarah trembling beside him, could sense her struggle between hope and despair. The offer was tempting: security, peace, a chance to finally stop running from his past. All he had to do was hand over a woman he barely knew to a man who would probably destroy her. But then Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the morning air. "Cole," she said, "look at me." He turned to meet her eyes, and what he saw there took his breath away. Not fear or pleading, but something fiercer, a determination that burned like a forge fire. This woman had already lost the man she loved, had been forced to flee for her life and her child's life, had been tortured and terrorized by Cain's men. And she was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to give in. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me," she said firmly. "Whatever Cain's offering, it's not worth your soul." Cole looked back at Cain, who was watching this exchange with obvious satisfaction. The cattle baron thought he'd already won, thought that fear and greed would triumph over principle, just as they always had before. He was wrong. "You know what, Cain?" Cole said, shouldering his rifle. "I've got a counteroffer for you." Cain's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm listening." "You turn around, ride out of here, and never come back. Forget Sarah exists, forget this ranch exists, and go find some other territory to pollute with your presence." Cain's laughter was genuinely amused this time. "And why would I do that?" Cole smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had once made Confederate soldiers think twice about charging his position. "Because if you don't, I'm going to spend every remaining day of my life hunting you down like the rabid dog you are. I'm going to take everything you've stolen, give it back to the people you stole it from, and when I'm done with that, I'm going to put you in the ground next to my brother." The laughter died on Cain's lips. For the first time since he'd arrived, the cattle baron looked uncertain, as though he was finally beginning to understand that Cole Mitchell wasn't just another small rancher who could be bought or intimidated. "You're making a very serious mistake," Cain said coldly. "No," Cole replied. "I'm finally fixing one." Cain stared at him for a long moment, then stepped back toward his horse. "Very well," he said. "You've chosen your path. But don't say I didn't give you a chance to do this the easy way." As Cain mounted his horse, Cole could see the wheels turning in the man's head, could practically watch him calculating his next move. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. But for the first time in 2 years, Cole felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Beside him, Sarah slipped her hand into his, and he squeezed it gently. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, and that made all the difference in the world. The dust from Cain's departure had barely settled when Cole began pacing the cabin like a caged wolf, his mind racing through possibilities and finding most of them leading to their graves. 20 professional gunmen, unlimited resources, and the backing of corrupt law enforcement. They were facing impossible odds, and both of them knew it. "We can't stay here," he said finally, stopping by the window to scan the horizon for any sign of Cain's men returning. "This cabin's a death trap. Too many approaches, not enough cover, and Cain knows exactly where to find us." Sarah sat at the small table, methodically cleaning and reloading the revolver she'd used to kill Brennan. Her hands were steady, but Cole could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged with the weight of everything they were facing. She was pregnant, traumatized, and running on pure adrenaline, but she was still the strongest person he'd ever met. "Where can we go?" she asked quietly. "Cain owns half the territory and the other half is scared to death of him. We can't exactly check into a hotel and wait for this to blow over." Cole had been thinking about that same problem, and he'd come to a conclusion that surprised even him. "There's one place Cain's money and influence can't reach," he said slowly, "the Ute Reservation up in the mountains. The tribal council has its own laws, its own sovereignty. If we could get there." Sarah looked up from her weapon, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since Cain's visit. "You think they'd help us?" "Maybe," Cole replied, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. I fought alongside some Ute scouts during the Indian Wars, saved a few lives, got my own saved in return. There's a chance they'd remember, but even as he spoke, Cole knew the journey would be nearly impossible. The reservation was 50 miles through some of the roughest country in Colorado, and Kane's men would be watching every trail. Sarah was in no condition for such a grueling ride, and they had no supplies, no horses beyond Cole's single mount, and no guarantee of sanctuary even if they made it. The sound of approaching riders made both of them freeze, weapons coming up instinctively as they prepared for another attack. But instead of Kane's men, Cole saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A small group of riders approaching under a white flag, moving slowly and deliberately to show they came in peace. "Stay ready," Cole warned, but something about the lead rider's posture looked familiar, stirring memories from his cavalry days. The group stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, and the man carrying the white flag called out in accented English, "Cole Mitchell. I am Joseph Standing Bear of the Ute people. I come to speak with you about old debts and new troubles." Cole's breath caught in his throat. Standing Bear, he remembered the name, remembered the proud warrior who'd saved his life during a blizzard near Pikes Peak, who'd shared his fire and his food when Cole would have died alone in the snow. But that had been 8 years ago, and Cole had never expected to see the man again. "It's all right," he told Sarah, shouldering his rifle and stepping onto the porch. "I know him." Standing Bear dismounted and walked toward the cabin, his movements fluid despite the years that had passed since their last meeting. He was older now, silver threading through his long black hair, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. Behind him, 3 younger warriors remained mounted, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "You have aged, my friend," Standing Bear said with the hint of a smile as he stopped at the base of the porch steps. "But you still have the look of a man who fights when fighting is needed." "Joseph," Cole replied, relief flooding through him. "What are you doing here?" "Word travels fast in the mountains," Standing Bear said. "We heard that Robert Kane had come calling with many guns, and that a woman was in danger. My people have no love for Kane. He has tried many times to steal our water rights, our hunting grounds. An enemy of Kane's is worth knowing." Cole felt Sarah step up beside him, and he saw Standing Bear's gaze take in her condition with the kind of awareness that came from a lifetime of reading people and situations. The Ute leader's expression softened slightly when he noticed her pregnancy. "This is Sarah," Cole said. "The woman Kane wants to claim as his property." Standing Bear's jaw tightened. "Kane believes he owns everything he sees: land, water, people. It is an old sickness among your kind, this need to possess what should be free." "Can you help us?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the desperation Cole could hear beneath it. "We can't fight Kane alone, but we won't surrender to him either." Standing Bear studied her for a long moment, then looked back at Cole. "You saved my son's life during the winter when the soldiers lost their way. Wounded Eagle still speaks of the white man who shared his medicine and his warmth when death was close. Such debts are not forgotten among my people." Hope flared in Cole's chest, but Standing Bear held up a hand before he could speak. "But," the Ute leader continued, "what you ask is not simple. Kane has friends in the territorial government, men who would see any aid to his enemies as an act of war against white settlers. My people have fought too many wars. We seek peace now, not new conflicts." "Then what do you suggest?" Cole asked, though he already suspected the answer wouldn't be what he wanted to hear. Standing Bear was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving between Cole and Sarah as though weighing possibilities on some internal scale. Finally he spoke. "There is another way. A harder way, but one that might give you the victory you seek." "I'm listening." "Kane's power comes from fear and corruption, but also from secrecy. He does his evil in darkness, away from the eyes of honest men. But if his crimes were brought into the light, if the territorial authorities were forced to see what he truly is," Standing Bear shrugged. "Even corruption has limits when the whole territory is watching." Cole frowned. "You're talking about evidence, proof of his crimes." "More than proof," Standing Bear said. "Truth that cannot be denied or buried. Kane has made many enemies over the years. Ranchers he has driven from their land, families he has destroyed, men he has had killed. Most are too afraid to speak, but if someone were to give them hope, to show them that Cain could be defeated. You're talking about starting a rebellion, Sarah said quietly. Standing Bear smiled, and there was something dangerous in the expression. I am talking about justice. Cain has been a cancer on this land for too long. It is time to cut him out. Cole felt something stirring in his chest. Not just hope, but purpose. This was bigger than just saving Sarah, bigger than avenging his brother. This was about stopping a predator who had terrorized an entire territory for decades. What would you need from us? He asked. Cain has a stronghold in Blackstone Canyon, a place where he keeps his records, his stolen deeds, the evidence of his crimes. If someone could get inside, could steal those documents and bring them to the territorial capital. It would be suicide, Cole said flatly. Cain's got that place guarded like Fort Knox. Maybe, Standing Bear agreed, but my scouts tell me that Cain has pulled most of his men back to guard his main holdings. He thinks you are beaten, thinks you will run or hide like rabbits. He does not expect you to attack. Sarah placed her hand on Cole's arm. It's too dangerous, she said firmly. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for some papers. But Cole was already seeing the possibilities, already planning the impossible. Not just me, he said slowly. Us. All of us. Cain expects me to run, expects you to hide. He doesn't expect us to come for him. Standing Bear nodded approvingly. Now you think like a warrior instead of a victim. But you will need more than courage. You will need allies, people willing to stand with you when the truth comes to light. And you think we can find them? I know you can, Standing Bear replied. My people will spread the word quietly. That Cole Mitchell and Sarah Bennett are gathering those who have been wronged by Cain, that the time has come to take back what was stolen. You would be surprised how many will answer such a call. Over the next hour, Standing Bear and his warriors shared their knowledge of Cain's operations, drawing maps in the dirt and explaining the layout of his stronghold. The plan that emerged was audacious to the point of madness. A small team would infiltrate Cain's compound during a gathering of his lieutenants, steal the evidence of his crimes, and escape before his forces could respond. It was the kind of plan that should have terrified Cole, but instead he felt more alive than he had in years. Finally, after running and hiding and grieving, he had a chance to strike back at the man who destroyed his family and countless others. As the sun began to set, Standing Bear prepared to leave. We will send word to those who have reason to hate Cain, he said. In 3 days, meet us at Devil's Rock at sunset. By then, we will know who stands with us and who remains in the shadows. After the Ute warriors had ridden away, Cole and Sarah sat together on the cabin's porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of autumn. You don't have to do this, Sarah said quietly. You could still take Standing Bear's offer, get me to the reservation where I'd be safe. You don't owe me anything more than you've already given. Cole turned to look at her, this remarkable woman who'd already sacrificed so much and was still thinking of others before herself. Maybe I don't owe you anything, he said, but I owe my brother justice. I owe James Morrison justice, and I owe every family Cain has destroyed a chance to see him pay for what he's done. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on her stomach. The baby's father would have liked you, she said finally. James always said the measure of a man wasn't in what he took, but in what he was willing to give up for what was right. Tell me about him, Cole said. Tell me about James. And as the night deepened around them, Sarah spoke of the man she'd loved and lost, while Cole listened and felt something new growing in his heart. Not just a desire for justice, but a need to be worthy of the woman beside him, to be the kind of man who could protect her and her child and maybe, just maybe, help them build something beautiful from the ashes of all they'd lost. 3 days until Devil's Rock. 3 days to prepare for a war that would either free them all or destroy them completely. But for tonight, they had each other, and that was enough. Devil's Rock stood like a sentinel against the Colorado sky, its granite face carved by wind and time into something that resembled a crouching demon in the fading light. Cole and Sarah had arrived an hour early, using the time to study the approaches and make sure they hadn't been followed. The journey from the cabin had taken 2 days of careful travel through back trails and hidden valleys, always watching for Kane's patrols, always ready to fight or run. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Cole counted the riders emerging from the surrounding terrain and felt his heart lift with something that might have been hope. Standing Bear had done his work well. More than a dozen men and women were converging on the ancient meeting place, each carrying their own grudge against Robert Kane, each ready to risk everything for a chance at justice. The first to arrive was Tom Bradley, a grizzled former sheriff who'd been run out of his job for refusing to take Kane's money. Behind him rode Martha Whitman, whose husband had been murdered when he wouldn't sell his water rights, and Bill Carson, a banker who'd lost everything when Kane's men burned his establishment for asking too many questions about illegal land transfers. One by one they came, a collection of the walking wounded that Kane had left in his wake over the years. Ranchers, merchants, lawmen, ordinary people who'd had their lives destroyed by one man's greed and brutality. Looking at them, Cole saw his own story reflected in their faces, saw the same mixture of grief and rage that had driven him across half the country seeking answers. Standing Bear materialized from the rocks as if he'd been carved from the stone itself, his warriors flanking him in a loose semicircle. The Ute leader's face was painted for war, and Cole noticed that he wore a cavalry saber at his side, a trophy from some long-ago battle, or perhaps a gift from a grateful white soldier. "You came," Standing Bear said simply, his gaze taking in the assembled group. "Good. Kane's evil has touched many lives, but tonight we begin to balance the scales." Tom Bradley spat into the dust, his weathered face hard as granite. "I've been waiting 5 years for a chance to bring that bastard down," he said. "What's the plan?" Standing Bear gestured toward a flat section of rock, and the group gathered around as he began to sketch Kane's stronghold with a piece of charcoal. "Blackstone Canyon," he said, "Kane's fortress, where he keeps his records and his stolen wealth. 20 men guard it always, but tomorrow night there will be fewer." "Why tomorrow night?" asked Martha Whitman, her voice carrying the steel that had kept her sane through years of widowhood and poverty. "Because tomorrow Kane hosts his monthly gathering of lieutenants and judges," Standing Bear replied, "a celebration of his power, where he divides his spoils and plans his next conquests. Half his guards will be serving as waiters and servants. The others will be drunk on his whiskey." Cole studied the crude map, his cavalry training automatically analyzing approaches and escape routes. "The compound's built into the canyon walls," he observed. "Only one way, in or out by horseback. If we get trapped in there—" "We won't get trapped," Standing Bear said with quiet confidence, "because we're not going in by horseback." He pointed to a section of the map that showed a narrow ledge running along the canyon's upper rim. "There is an old Ute trail that leads down from above. My ancestors used it to hunt bighorn sheep in the days when the canyon ran with clear water. It is dangerous, especially at night, but it leads directly to the rear of Kane's compound." Sarah leaned forward, studying the map intently. "What about the safe?" she asked. "Kane's not stupid enough to leave important documents lying around where anyone can find them." Standing Bear smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "According to my sources, Kane keeps his most precious secrets in a steel safe behind a painting in his private study. The combination," he paused dramatically, "is his late wife's birthday. The man's arrogance knows no bounds." "How do you know all this?" Bradley asked suspiciously. "Because Kane's household staff includes several men and women whose families my people have helped over the years," Standing Bear replied. "Loyalty flows both ways, Sheriff. Kane has forgotten that the people he considers beneath his notice still have eyes and ears." The plan that emerged over the next hour was audacious in its simplicity. A small team would descend the canyon trail while Kane's gathering was in full swing, infiltrate his study, steal the documents, and escape before anyone knew they'd been there. Meanwhile, the rest of the group would position themselves along the escape routes, ready to provide covering fire if things went wrong. "I'll lead the infiltration team," Cole said, but Standing Bear shook his head. "You will be one of 3, the Ute leader corrected. "This requires more than courage. It requires knowledge of what we seek and the ability to recognize its importance." He turned to Sarah, who had been unusually quiet during the planning. "You lived in Kane's house as his intended bride. You know the layout, the hiding places, the routines of his servants." Sarah's face went pale. You want me to go back there? While I'm... She gestured at her pregnancy, which was becoming more obvious with each passing day. I want you to help us destroy the man who killed the father of your child, Standing Bear said gently, and to help ensure that what happened to you never happens to another woman. Cole started to protest, but Sarah held up her hand. He's right, she said quietly. I know that house better than anyone. I know where Cain keeps his secrets, and I know how to move through it without being seen. She looked at Cole, her eyes blazing with determination. Besides, I have more reason than anyone to see this through. The third member of the infiltration team was introduced as Samuel Crowfeather, Standing Bear's nephew and a scout who'd spent years mapping every trail and hiding place in the territory. He was young, maybe 25, but he moved with the fluid confidence of a man who'd never met terrain he couldn't navigate. As the meeting broke up and the participants began to drift away to their assigned positions, Cole found himself alone with Sarah on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley below. The last light of day was fading from the sky, and the first stars were beginning to appear overhead. You don't have to do this, he said for what felt like the 100th time. It's too dangerous, especially in your condition. Sarah turned to face him, and in the starlight he could see the ghost of the frightened woman he'd found tied to his fence. But that woman was gone now, replaced by someone harder, more determined, more dangerous. Cole, she said softly, do you know what Cain told me the night before I escaped? Cole shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. He said that after I bore him a son, he'd make sure I never had another child with anyone else. He said he'd cut me, damage me in ways that wouldn't show, but would make sure I belonged only to him. Her voice remained steady, but Cole could see her hands shaking. And then he said he'd do the same thing to any other woman who caught his fancy, because he'd realized that broken things were easier to control. Cole felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. Sarah. So yes, she continued, I'm going back to that house. I'm going to walk through those rooms where he threatened me, where he hurt me, where he planned to destroy me. And I'm going to take everything from him, just like he tried to take everything from me. Cole reached out and took her hand, feeling the strength in her fingers despite their trembling. Then we do this together, he said. Whatever happens, we face it together. Sarah smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since that first day at the fence. Together, she agreed. The next evening found them crouched on the canyon rim, watching the lights and sounds of Cain's gathering drift up from below. Even from their elevated position, they could hear the laughter and music, could smell the rich aromas of roasted meat and expensive cigars. Cain was celebrating his power, while the territory he'd terrorized prepared to strike back. Remember, Standing Bear whispered as they prepared to begin their descent. We have perhaps 2 hours before the gathering ends, and Cain's guests begin to leave. After that, security will return to normal levels. Samuel Crowfeather had already disappeared over the edge, his rope secured to a massive boulder. Sarah would go next, then Cole, with Standing Bear bringing up the rear. The plan was simple enough. Reach the bottom, infiltrate the compound, steal the documents, and escape. But Cole had been in enough battles to know that simple plans rarely survived contact with reality. Sarah, he said as she prepared to follow Samuel down the cliff face, if anything goes wrong, nothing's going wrong, she said firmly. We've come too far to fail now. And with that, she was gone, rappelling down the cliff with the confidence of someone who'd already faced her worst fears and survived them. Cole watched until she disappeared into the shadows below, then began his own descent into what felt very much like the mouth of hell itself. 20 minutes later, they were crouched in the rocks behind Cain's compound, watching the guards and servants move through their routines. The house itself was blazing with light, every window glowing like a beacon in the darkness. Cole could see figures moving back and forth behind the curtains, could hear the sound of violins and laughter drifting on the night air. The study is on the second floor, third window from the left, Sarah whispered, pointing to a darkened window overlooking the rear courtyard. Cain never allows servants in there during gatherings. He's too paranoid about people seeing his private business. Standing Bear nodded toward a trellis that ran up the side of the building, thick with climbing roses that would provide both handholds and cover. Can you climb that in your condition? Sarah's smile was sharp as a knife blade. Try and stop me. As they began to move toward the house, Cole felt time slowing down the way it always did before a battle. Every sense was heightened, every detail crystal clear. This was the moment when everything would either come together or fall apart completely. Behind them in the darkness of the canyon, their allies waited with weapons ready and horses saddled for a desperate escape. Ahead lay Kane's fortress and the secrets that could destroy him. Between them stretched a few hundred yards of open ground and the most dangerous climb of their lives. The climb up the rose trellis was harder than Sarah had expected, her pregnant body making every movement awkward and uncertain. The thorns caught at her clothing and skin, drawing small lines of blood that she ignored as she focused on the darkened window above. Behind her, she could hear Cole's steady breathing, feel his presence like a protective shadow ready to catch her if she fell. Samuel Crow Feather had already reached the second floor and was working on the window latch with tools that gleamed dully in the starlight. Standing Bear remained on the ground, watching for guards and ready to signal if their luck ran out. So far, Kane's arrogance was working in their favor. His security was focused outward, watching for attacks from the canyon entrance, not from above. Got it, Samuel whispered as the window slid open with barely a sound. He slipped inside like smoke, followed by Sarah and then Cole. The study was exactly as Sarah remembered it. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and an enormous desk that spoke of a man who believed his own importance justified any excess. But it was the painting behind the desk that drew their attention. A portrait of a stern-faced woman with Kane's cold eyes, rendered in oils that had probably cost more than most people made in a year. Sarah had met the late Mrs. Kane once, briefly, and had seen immediately where Robert had learned his casual cruelty. "Help me move this," Cole whispered, and together they carefully lifted the painting away from the wall, revealing a steel safe built into the stone foundation. The lock was a combination dial, just as Standing Bear had promised, and Sarah found herself holding her breath as Cole began to turn it. "What was the date?" he asked softly. "March 15th, 1828, Sarah replied, remembering the birthday celebrations she'd been forced to attend in the dead woman's honor. Kane had spoken of his wife with the same possessive pride he showed for his best horses. The safe clicked open on the third try, and Cole's sharp intake of breath told Sarah they'd found what they were looking for. Inside were stacks of documents, deeds, contracts, correspondence, and what looked like a ledger book bound in red leather. Cole began stuffing papers into a leather satchel they'd brought for the purpose, while Sarah kept watch at the window. "This is it," Cole whispered, holding up a bundle of papers tied with black ribbon. Letters between Kane and territorial judges, discussing payments for favorable rulings. And this. He held up another document that made Sarah's blood run cold. A contract with the Pinkerton Detective Agency for the murder of anyone who interfered with Kane's business operations. Among the papers was a list of names, men and women who had crossed Kane over the years, with notations beside each name indicating their fate. Samuel Mitchell was there, marked as eliminated, water rights acquired. James Morrison was listed as eliminated, romantic interference resolved. Dozens of other names told the story of Kane's systematic destruction of anyone who opposed him. But it was the final document that made Sarah's hands shake with rage. A detailed plan for the expansion of Kane's empire, including the forced relocation of the Ute Reservation and the establishment of what Kane called breeding programs for women who caught his interest. Sarah's name was at the top of a list that included 6 other young women, all marked as acquired or pending acquisition. "We have enough," Cole said grimly, closing the satchel. "Let's get out of here before—" The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made them all freeze. Heavy boots moving with purpose toward the study door. Someone was coming, and there was nowhere to hide. "The window," Samuel whispered urgently, but it was too late. The door was already opening, spilling light from the hallway into the darkened room. Robert Kane stepped inside, and for a moment he simply stared at the 3 intruders as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He was still dressed in his party clothes, an expensive suit and gold watch chain, but his face carried the cold fury of a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. "Well," he said finally, his voice deadly quiet. The rabbit returns to the trap of her own accord. Behind him, two of his guards appeared in the doorway, guns drawn and ready. Sarah recognized them both, brutal men who'd taken evident pleasure in their work during her captivity. Mr. Kane, one of them said, want us to kill the men and take the woman? Kane held up a hand, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Not yet. I want to know what they think they've accomplished here. He gestured toward the open safe. Stealing papers? Documents? Do you really think pieces of paper will bring me down? Cole stepped protectively in front of Sarah, the satchel clutched tightly in his hands. These papers prove you're a murderer and a thief. When the territorial authorities see them, Kane's laughter cut him off. The territorial authorities? You mean Judge Morrison, who's been on my payroll for 8 years? Or perhaps Sheriff Davis, who owes his position to my generous campaign contributions? Kane shook his head in mock sympathy. You really don't understand how this works, do you? But it was Sarah who spoke next, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. Maybe the territorial authorities won't help, she said, but the federal marshals will. And the newspapers. And when every honest person in Colorado sees what you really are, all your money won't be able to buy you safety. Kane's expression darkened. You always were too clever for your own good, he said, but cleverness without power is just noise, and I have more power than you can imagine. He nodded to his guards, who began to advance into the room, but they'd taken only 2 steps when the sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere below. Shouts and screams echoed through the house as Standing Bear's diversionary attack commenced right on schedule. In the chaos that followed, Samuel Crow Feather moved like lightning, his knife finding the throat of the nearest guard before the man could even raise his weapon. Cole tackled the second guard, and they went down in a tangle of limbs, fighting desperately for control of the man's pistol. Kane reached for the gun at his belt, but Sarah was faster. The revolver Cole had given her appeared in her hands as though by magic, its barrel trained steady on Kane's chest despite the trembling in her arms. Don't, she said quietly. Please don't make me kill you in front of my child. Kane froze, his hand halfway to his weapon. For the first time since she'd known him, Sarah saw something like uncertainty in his eyes. You won't shoot, he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. You're not a killer. You made me one, Sarah replied. You turned me into something I never wanted to be when you murdered the man I loved, when you tied me to that fence and left me to die, when you threatened to cut me so I could never bear another man's children. Kane's face went pale as he realized she was serious. Sarah, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, she said, her finger tightening on the trigger. But I'm not going to kill you. Do you know why? Kane shook his head, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. Because I want you to live long enough to see everything you've built turn to ashes. I want you to watch as every family you've destroyed gets their justice. I want you to know that the child you tried to claim as your heir will grow up free, with a father who chose to love us instead of own us. Cole had finished with the second guard and was now standing beside her, his own weapon trained on Kane. It's over, he said simply. Your empire, your power, your ability to hurt innocent people. It's all finished. The gunfire below was moving closer now, and through the window they could see flames beginning to lick at the outbuildings. Standing Bear's men were doing their work well, creating enough chaos to cover their escape. The ledger, Cole said urgently. Where's the red ledger? Sarah's eyes widened as she remembered. The safe. There was another compartment. She moved quickly to the still open safe, feeling along the back wall until her fingers found a hidden latch. A second panel swung open, revealing a red leather book that contained the true record of Kane's crimes. Names, dates, amounts paid, and services rendered in the careful handwriting of a man who trusted no one with his secrets. Cole grabbed the ledger and stuffed it into the satchel with the other documents. Now we go, he said. Sarah, can you make it down the trellis? I can make it, she said firmly, though the strain of the evening was beginning to show in her face. The baby seemed to sense her stress, shifting restlessly in her womb. They left Kane standing in his ruined study, his empire crumbling around him as his own guards turned on each other in the chaos below. By the time he recovered enough to call for help, they were already rappelling down the canyon wall, the precious evidence secure in Cole's satchel. The ride to safety was a blur of pounding hooves and adrenaline, but they made it to the rendezvous point where Standing Bear waited with fresh horses and news that their mission had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. Kane's compound was in flames, his guards scattered or dead, and word was already spreading throughout the territory that the tyrant's reign was ending. 3 months later, Sarah gave birth to a son in the cabin that had become their home, with Cole holding her hand and Standing Bear's wife serving as midwife. The federal investigation prompted by their stolen documents had destroyed Kane's network of corruption, sending him to federal prison for the rest of his natural life. As Cole held his son, for he was his son now, in every way that mattered, he thought about the strange path that had brought them all together. He'd come to Colorado running from his past, expecting to die alone and forgotten. Instead, he'd found a woman worth fighting for, a cause worth dying for, and a future worth living for. "What should we name him?" Sarah asked, her voice tired but happy as she watched Cole cradle the baby. Cole looked down at the tiny face, at the child who would grow up free because brave people had been willing to fight for justice. "James," he said softly, "James Mitchell. So he'll always know that love is stronger than fear and that some things are worth any sacrifice." Outside, the Colorado sun was rising over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. It was going to be a beautiful day. And so ends the incredible true story of Cole Mitchell and Sarah Bennett. Two broken souls who found each other in the darkest of circumstances and discovered that sometimes the most powerful words aren't "I love you," but "cut me free." Their tale reminds us that real love isn't about possession. It's about liberation, about seeing someone's chains and choosing to break them rather than add more. When Sarah whispered those desperate words, "Spread it open, cut me free," she wasn't just asking Cole to cut the ropes that bound her to that fence. She was asking him to free her from a life of fear, from a world where women were treated as property, from a future that held nothing but darkness. And when Cole chose to pick up that knife, he wasn't just saving a stranger, he was choosing to become the man he was meant to be. What strikes me most about their story is how Sarah transformed from victim to warrior, never losing her humanity, but finding a strength she never knew she possessed. Her journey from the terrified woman tied to a fence to the fierce mother holding a gun on her tormentor shows us that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about refusing to let cruelty define who you become. Cole's transformation was equally powerful. He came to Colorado running from grief and guilt, expecting to fade away in obscurity. Instead, he found a purpose worth dying for and a love worth living for. His willingness to fight an entire corrupt system for one pregnant woman and her unborn child proves that heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and choosing to act anyway. Their love story wasn't built on grand romantic gestures or perfect circumstances. It was forged in blood and gunpowder, in shared danger and mutual respect, in the kind of partnership that emerges when two people decide to face hell together rather than heaven alone. Cole didn't save Sarah. They saved each other. The birth of baby James represents more than just a new life. It symbolizes hope triumphing over despair, love conquering evil, and the promise that the children of tomorrow will grow up free because brave people were willing to fight for justice today. That little boy will never know the fear his mother lived with, will never wonder if he's worth protecting, because his parents made sure he'd inherit a world where bullies like Robert Kane couldn't terrorize the innocent. Perhaps the most beautiful part of their story is how it reminds us that families aren't just born, they're chosen. Cole chose to love Sarah's child as his own, just as Sarah chose to trust Cole with her heart and her future. Together, they built something beautiful from the ashes of everything they'd lost. If this incredible tale of courage, justice, and unbreakable love moved you, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you thought of Sarah's transformation from victim to warrior. Have you ever had to choose between safety and doing what's right? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American frontier, where ordinary people did extraordinary things and love truly could conquer all. Ring that notification bell so you never miss these incredible true tales of courage, justice, and the power of refusing to give up. And remember, somewhere in your own life, there might be someone who needs you to cut them free. When that moment comes, may you have the courage of Cole Mitchell to pick up the knife and the strength of Sarah Bennett to never stop fighting for what's right.